I'd been working in the county library archives for 12 years before I found the photograph. It wasn't a discovery that came with any fanfare. I wasn't searching for it. In truth, I was looking for something else entirely, a record of property deeds from the late 1800s, tied to a restoration project for the Whitby Historical Society. The library basement was a cold, indifferent place. Rows of steel cabinets lined the walls, humming faintly under fluorescent lights that flickered with a tired persistence. Dust lay on everything like a second skin. The shelves were filled with what no one else wanted: unclaimed donations, discarded parish ledgers, unwanted private collections. The photograph came from one of those donations, a box marked Merriman Estate, 1890 to 1904. It had been sitting untouched on the lower shelf of cabinet 9B for as long as I'd worked there. I remember brushing my hand across the lid, leaving a trail in the dust. The box was heavier than I expected. Inside were dozens of curled sepia prints, loose negatives, and 2 glass plate photographs wrapped in brittle newspaper. At the bottom, almost hidden beneath a folded piece of linen, was the portrait. It was larger than the others, maybe 12 by 10 inches, and mounted on a thick backing card with the embossed seal of Alfred C. Weathers, Photographic Studio, Manchester, 1890. I lifted it carefully under the light. It showed a family, a large one, perhaps 10 or 11 members. The patriarch sat in front, bearded and solemn, his wife beside him in the high-necked fashion of the era. Around them stood their children, the older ones straight-backed, the younger ones fidgeting slightly as if the long exposure had tried their patience. It was a fine composition, rich shadows, good contrast, clear focus. Yet, something about it unsettled me. I didn't see it right away. My mind registered the formal arrangement, the detail of the clothing, the stiffness of the expressions. And then something else. A faint shape between the 2 tallest figures in the back row. At first, I thought it was an artifact, a smudge on the emulsion, perhaps a trick of developing fluid that had eaten through the image. But when I adjusted the angle, letting the light slide across the gloss, I saw a face, small, childlike, half-faded. A little girl standing slightly behind the family, though her proportions were wrong, too small, her eyes too dark. She looked directly at the camera, yet her outline wasn't solid. It was as though she'd been caught between one world and another, the shutter closing too late to decide which. The more I stared, the colder the room seemed to grow. I leaned closer, tracing the faint silhouette with my fingertip without touching the surface. The child's expression wasn't frightened exactly. It was watchful. Her face had the blurred texture of motion, but the rest of her, the dress, the hands, was perfectly still. I checked the label on the back of the photograph. Someone had written in spidery ink, "The Ashcroft Family, Manchester, 1890. Below that, another hand, heavier, perhaps added later, had written a single line, "Do not display." By closing time, I was still staring at it. I scanned the print into our digital database, adjusting the contrast slightly. The girl's face became clearer, soft curls, a faint outline of collar lace, eyes staring just past the camera. I compared it with the rest of the family. There were 2 girls around her age, both standing in front, their expressions neutral. No one in the group seemed to be looking toward where she stood. She shouldn't have been there. When I closed the image window, the computer screen flickered, freezing for a split second before returning to the desktop. I brushed it off as nothing. This machine crashed often. But when I shut it down, the screen lingered one heartbeat too long on the faint outline of that face. I couldn't leave it alone. The next morning, before the archive opened, I began searching the library database. The Ashcroft name appeared in several records, a prosperous textile family from Manchester who donated to several local schools in the late 19th century. The patriarch, Samuel Ashcroft, had run a mill in Salford. The family's address matched an old estate, Hollowfield House, demolished in 1923. I found a brief article in the Manchester Guardian, dated December 3, 1891. Tragedy at Hollowfield House, death of a child. Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Ashcroft mourn the loss of their youngest daughter, Clara, aged 6, who passed away after a sudden illness described by family doctors as a case of spontaneous fever. The family, well known for their charitable work in Salford, request privacy. There was no mention of her burial, but the date caught my attention. December 1891. A full year after the photograph had been taken. That shouldn't have meant anything. Yet the more I looked at the photo, the less I could ignore how real she seemed. When I enlarged the image, I noticed something else. The shadow that should have fallen across her face, cast by the figure standing in front of her, wasn't there. Her lighting was wrong, brighter, as though she stood under a different sun. I decided to bring the photograph upstairs, closer to the main reading room lights. The library had just opened, and the scent of dust and old paper mixed with coffee from the front desk. As I carried it up, I noticed faint moisture on the glass surface. Condensation, I thought. But when I wiped it with my sleeve, it smeared faintly red-brown. My first thought was rust, though the frame had none. When I reached my desk, I noticed something else missing. The Do Not Display note. It had been attached to the back of the mount. Now the space where it had been was clean. Too clean, as if the paper had never existed. I felt a small pulse in the air, like static before a storm. Around noon, a regular visitor stopped by, Mr. Kent, a retired historian who spent his days combing through parish records. He had a habit of peering over whatever I was working on, usually with harmless curiosity. "What have you got there, Ms. Lee?" he asked, leaning on his cane. "Photograph. Late Victorian. Donated years ago." He bent closer, squinting through his glasses. "Ah, fine composition, but—" He paused, narrowing his eyes at the back row. "That's peculiar. Was this retouched?" I told him no, not to my knowledge. He tapped the glass with one trembling finger, pointing directly at the girl. That technique, double exposure, they used it for memorial portraits sometimes, usually after the child had passed. He looked at me as though to gauge my reaction. "You know about memento mori, don't you?" I nodded. "Post-mortem photography. But she doesn't look posed." "No," he murmured, eyes fixed on her faint shape. "She looks alive." That night, after closing, I stayed in the archive. The silence down there had a different weight now. The hum of the lights seemed lower, the air thicker. I placed the photograph on the table under the magnifier lamp. The glass reflected my own face back at me, pale and anxious. For a moment I almost packed it away. But something kept me. I wanted to know if the double exposure could be proven, if there were two negatives, one overlaid upon the other. The Weathers Studio stamp meant the plate might still exist. I opened the old linen wrap where the other glass negatives had been stored, but it was empty. Only one plate remained, still slick with a faint residue of oil. I held it to the light. The emulsion side shimmered faintly. And there she was again. Not faint this time. Not behind the family. Alone, staring straight at me. Her mouth was open as though speaking. I lowered the plate quickly, my pulse thudding. For a second, I thought I'd seen her lips move, but of course that was impossible. When I turned to set the plate down, a noise stopped me cold. A click, like a camera shutter. Only there were no cameras in the room. I went home that night, telling myself it was fatigue, overwork. The air in that basement was damp and heavy. People hallucinated in archives all the time. But as I passed my hallway mirror, something caught in my peripheral vision. A faint silhouette beside me, a child's. I turned sharply, Nothing there. Still, I didn't sleep. I kept seeing that faint face, the one behind the family, watching quietly, as if waiting for the next exposure. The following morning, I arrived at the library before sunrise. The janitor's mop still left faint trails on the marble floor, and the air smelled of bleach and rain. I unlocked the archive door, heart pounding a little faster than I'd admit. The photograph wasn't on my desk. I remembered leaving it under the magnifier lamp the night before. Now only the felt mat remained, faintly damp as if something wet had rested there overnight. My first thought was that someone had moved it to cold storage, but the catalogue list hadn't been updated. Then I noticed the envelope. A small manila envelope sat in the center of the desk. No markings, no return address. Inside, wrapped in tissue, was a contact print, the same Ashcroft portrait, but cropped differently. The family stood closer now, the edges trimmed inward, cutting off the outermost children. And the little girl, the faint, half-visible one, was clearer. I could see the detail of her dress, the folds of the fabric, the soft blur of movement, as if she'd turned her head a fraction of a second before the exposure finished. Her eyes were dark, almost depthless. But the strangest part was her mouth. It was open. When I checked the digital scan from the day before, her lips had been closed. I printed both images and compared them side by side. The differences were subtle but undeniable. The newer print wasn't a duplicate. It was a continuation, as if the photograph were still developing. I needed to find the original studio records. The Weathers Photographic Studio had been one of Manchester's most respected portrait houses in the 1880s and 1890s. I'd seen their name in dozens of family collections, known for clarity, detail, and a curious tendency towards starkness. The faces always seemed a little too sharp, the eyes too alive. I called the city registrar's office to ask whether any of the Weathers archives survived. The clerk, a patient man named Albright, promised to check. He called back 2 hours later. The Weathers studio closed in 1891, he said. The photographer died suddenly. Most of the negatives were sold to a glassworks company, but some ledgers were kept. They're in the Manchester Historical Depository, box reference MHD/13-8. He paused. You're not the first to ask about them. Who else? I asked. Some museum researcher a few months ago. Didn't leave a name. Requested only the ledger for late 1890, the same month your photograph was taken. That evening, I signed out the library car and drove through the rain to the depository, a concrete bunker of a building near the river, its windows bricked up decades ago. Inside, the clerk guided me to the manuscript reading room, a space that smelled of mildew and iodine. The Weathers ledger was bound in cracked leather, its pages covered in tight copper plate. Each entry listed the client's name, date, type of photograph, and number of exposures. I found the Ashcrofts easily enough. November 14th, 1890, family portrait, full plate, exposure time 17 seconds, additional exposure requested. Below that, faintly penciled in another hand, were 2 words, third image accepted. I flipped to the following page. December 2nd, 1890. Posthumous commission. Same family. 1 subject only. Exposure time unknown. Delivered. December 9th. A note followed in faint red ink. Subject unstable during process. Recommend no further attempts. I copied the entries and returned to my flat. The rain hadn't let up. The windows drummed with it. I set the photocopies on my kitchen table beside the 2 prints. A thought gnawed at me. If the posthumous commission referred to the youngest daughter, Clara, that meant Weathers had attempted a memorial portrait after her death. But the family photograph had been taken the month before, so how was she already in it? I stared at her face on the print, trying to imagine how the photographer might have done it. Double exposure was possible, yes, but there was no second figure overlapping, no ghostly transparency. Her lighting didn't match the rest of the scene, and yet she fit perfectly in scale and perspective. It wasn't a trick. It was additive, as if she had arrived later. At midnight, my power flickered. The lights dimmed, then steadied. I heard a sound like paper shifting. When I turned, the photograph had slid from the table to the floor. I bent to pick it up and froze. The girl's head was turned. Not much. Just a few degrees to the left, her gaze no longer meeting the camera, but angled towards something outside the frame. Her expression had changed too. The slight parting of her lips had become a full, sorrowful frown. I felt suddenly, irrationally, that she was looking at me, that she wanted something. I brought the photograph back to the library the next morning. I told myself I was just being responsible, securing it with the rest of the Merriman estate materials. But the truth was, I didn't want it near me anymore. When I arrived, the security guard, Janice, stopped me at the door. "You're the one who's been in the archives after hours, right?" I hesitated. "Yes." "Funny thing," she said. "Last night, the motion sensor tripped down there. The camera feed showed the light flicking on, then..." She tapped her phone, scrolling. "Look." The footage showed the archive room bathed in yellow light. A faint figure moved across the frame, small, child-sized, flickering as though the feed couldn't decide whether she was there or not. The timestamp read 2:17 a.m. I didn't remember waking up, but I knew I'd been dreaming then, of the same room, the same light. That afternoon, I found a reference to a surviving branch of the Weathers family, a great-grandson living in Liverpool. His name was Thomas Weathers, an amateur historian who'd given a talk on early photographic techniques at the university some years earlier. I called him. His voice trembled slightly with age. "You found one of Alfred's plates?" he asked. "Yes, a family portrait. The Ashcrofts, November 1890. Silence. Then, "Destroy it." I thought I'd misheard. "Excuse me." "Burn it," he said, his tone flat. "If you can. But you won't be able to. None of us ever could." He sighed heavily. My great-grandfather's notebooks describe the final months of his life. He became obsessed with something he called the residuals, after images that appeared on his negatives weeks after exposure. He believed the glass itself remembered. That light wasn't just reflection, it was retention. I gripped the phone tighter. Retention of what? "Of the soul," he whispered. He thought the lens could hold what death took away. That if you adjusted exposure long enough, the camera could reopen the shutter between worlds. He coughed, then added, "He died in December 1891, same as the Ashcroft girl." That night, I locked the photograph in the library's preservation cabinet. I told myself it would be safe there, but at 3 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a motion alert from the security system. "Movement detected. Archive room B." I turned on the remote feed. The camera view was grainy, bathed in that same weak yellow light. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then the figure appeared, small and indistinct, standing before the cabinet. The child. The feed froze as she lifted her head. For a fraction of a second, the face came into focus, her mouth open as if speaking my name, then static. When the picture returned, the cabinet door was open. The photograph was gone. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? The next morning, the librarian on duty found me asleep at my desk, eyes red, coffee cold. She told me I'd probably overworked myself again. She wasn't wrong. But when I returned to the archives, there was something new on the wall near cabinet 9B, a framed photograph I'd never seen before. It was the same family portrait, except the librarian's desk, my desk, was faintly visible behind them. By the next morning, the photograph had disappeared from the wall as quietly as it had appeared. No one else had seen it. Janice swore she hadn't touched a thing. I should have been relieved, but relief was no longer something I recognized. Every surface in that archive seemed to hum faintly now. The filing cabinets, the steel shelves, even the fluorescent tubes. It was as if the air itself held a low electrical memory, a vibration you could feel more than hear. When I touched the spot where the frame had been, my fingertips came away sticky with collodion. That was when I made my decision. If Alfred Weathers's camera had survived, it would be in one place, the studio itself. The ledgers listed its location as Harcourt Street, Manchester, demolished in 1901 after a fire. But the city never truly erases its bones. I'd seen the name still printed faintly on the wall of an old textile warehouse near Deansgate, the ghost of white paint that read, "A C. Weathers and Company, Photographic Portraiture." So that night, after the library closed, I went. The building sat half-buried behind newer structures, its roof sagging, windows blind with soot. The sign above the door was barely legible, but I could trace the outline of the letters with my flashlight. Inside, dust swirled like breath in the beam. The front room had once been a reception hall, now filled with rotted wooden chairs and the smell of mildew. At the back, a narrow staircase led up into darkness. The air changed as I climbed, colder, thinner, carrying that same metallic tang as the photograph. The top landing opened into what must have been the main studio. The skylight overhead was broken, letting in thin sheets of moonlight. Against the far wall stood a large brass camera, its bellows collapsed but intact. The lens gleamed faintly even in the dark, as though still watching. Beside it was a small table. On it lay a book. The leather cover was cracked but legible. Exposure Ledger, 1890 to 1891. My pulse quickened as I opened it. The handwriting was the same as the ledger I'd seen in the archive. Neat copperplate, slightly faded. But these entries were different. They weren't lists of clients. They were names and descriptions. Each line read like a record of something unseen. November 14, 1890. The Ashcrofts. Light strong. Subject in flux. Retained image satisfactory. November 22. Test on residual emulsion. Subject reappears in different frame. Voice in development bath, audible. December 9. Clara complete. Process irreversible. Light remembers. At the bottom of the page, in smeared ink, one final line. The lens has learned to open itself. A sound made me freeze, a faint click. Metal against metal. I turned slowly. The camera's shutter had moved. The lens was open, faintly glowing from within, a soft golden pulse like a heartbeat under glass. I stepped closer, drawn by something I couldn't name. The air grew heavier, charged. My reflection warped in the glass, first elongated, then doubled, as if the light were splitting around me. For a moment I thought I saw the little girl again, reflected beside me. Then she blinked. The flash went off. It wasn't a modern bulb's white glare. It was the deep, amber flare of magnesium powder, sudden and absolute. The light filled my head, searing through my eyelids, carrying a smell of smoke and salt. When I came to, I was lying on the floor. The room was darker now, the moonlight muted. My flashlight flickered weakly beside me. The camera sat motionless again, shutter closed, the air heavy with ozone. I pushed myself up and saw the photograph. It lay on the table, still damp, the paper curling at the edges. A new print. The Ashcroft family again, posed exactly as before. But this time, there was someone standing among them, in the back row, between the eldest son and daughter. A woman in modern clothing, her eyes wide with shock. Me. I ran. Down the stairs, through the debris, out into the rain. The night air hit me like a wall. I drove straight back to the library, Headlights carving the darkness like blades. My mind wouldn't form words, only fragments of memory, of faces, of that blinding flash. When I arrived, I didn't even bother with the lights. I went straight to the archive vault and pulled open the drawer where I'd stored the Merriman box. It wasn't there. In its place lay a single envelope. Inside, another photograph, the same family. But this one was different. The edges were burnt, the surface glossy with wet chemicals. The faces were sharper, more defined. The parents looked directly at me now, their expressions softened into something almost sympathetic. And in the center of the frame, where the girl had once stood, where my image had been, there was now only an empty space. At the bottom, scrawled in graphite, the words, "Exposure complete." I should have stopped then. I should have destroyed it, like Thomas Weathers had begged me to. But I couldn't. The thought of burning it felt wrong, sacrilegious somehow. So instead, I sealed it in an acid-free envelope and locked it in the deepest cabinet, behind the oldest parish ledgers. Then I went home and told myself it was over. It wasn't. The following week, the Manchester Historical Society contacted the library. They were cataloguing a set of anonymous glass negatives found during the renovation of an old textile warehouse, the same district where the Weathers studio had stood. They sent digital scans to confirm whether the library might own duplicates. When I opened the files, my stomach turned to ice. The first few were ordinary portraits, stern Victorian faces frozen by long exposure. But the last series was different. It showed a woman in a modern blouse, seated stiffly on a wooden chair. Behind her, arranged like a tableau, stood the Ashcroft family. The file name was dated 2 nights earlier. I hadn't left my flat in those 2 nights. That evening, I noticed a faint light leaking from the cupboard where I kept the envelope. A thin line, the color of dark honey, pulsing softly through the wood grain. When I opened the door, the light vanished. Only the envelope remained. But when I lifted it, I realized it wasn't empty anymore. Something inside it shifted, heavy, uneven, as though a damp photograph were trying to move. I tore it open. The print inside was still wet. The chemicals burned my fingertips. It showed the library basement, the cabinets, the desk, me, or someone shaped like me, standing by the magnifier lamp, holding the same photograph, staring at the same scene. And behind her, behind me, a small girl, her hand resting on my shoulder, eyes bright as candle flame. I dropped it. The paper hissed as it hit the floor, smoking slightly. When I picked it up again, the image had changed. The girl was gone. The room behind me was empty. But my own reflection in the glass of the photograph was still moving, breathing, blinking slowly, trapped mid-motion like a living negative. I put the photo back in the envelope, locked it in the safe, and left the key inside. Then I wrote my resignation letter. I told the director I was leaving for health reasons. I never mentioned the photograph. That was 3 months ago. Now, in my new position at a small parish library outside York, I try not to think about it. But sometimes, when the light hits the shelves just right, the reflections in the glass doors multiply. For a moment, I'll see a child standing between them, her eyes calm, her expression patient, as though waiting for the next shutter to fall. And in that instant, the air changes, that same faint scent of collodion and ozone returning like an old memory. Some nights I dream of the Ashcroft family, not as ghosts, but as photographs, perfectly still, eternal, watching from the silver emulsion of their world, waiting for someone to look long enough to make the light remember again, because that's all it takes, 1 glance, 1 second of exposure. Light remembers, it always remembers.